You don't get to walk into this courthouse looking like that and expect special treatment." The words cracked across the marble lobby so loudly that conversation stopped in every direction. Claire Whitmore froze beside the security checkpoint, one hand wrapped around the handle of her small black suitcase, the other clutching a navy folder against her chest. Rainwater still clung to the hem of her beige coat from the storm outside, and a silver airport tag swung softly from her luggage like a tiny pendulum. The courthouse smelled like wet concrete, burnt coffee, and polished stone. People in dark suits hurried past carrying legal files and paper cups, but now all eyes were turning toward her. Officer Daniel Hayes stepped closer, broad shoulders stiff beneath his uniform, his badge catching the cold white light pouring through the courthouse windows nearly 30 feet above the lobby floor. "ID," he said flatly. Claire blinked once, calm but visibly exhausted. She had landed less than an hour ago after an overnight flight from Chicago, and the shadows beneath her eyes made her look smaller than she really was. "Sir, I'm here for a scheduled meeting upstairs," she answered quietly. Hayes glanced at her wrinkled coat, then at her worn leather shoes. His expression hardened. "Yeah? And I'm supposed to believe that?" A few people nearby slowed their pace. Someone near the metal detectors whispered something under their breath. Claire reached carefully into her bag, but before she could pull anything out, Hayes grabbed the navy folder from her hands. Papers slipped loose and scattered across the polished floor like white leaves in a storm. The sound echoed sharply through the lobby. Claire immediately bent down to gather them, cheeks flushing red, but Hayes didn't help. He stared down at her with folded arms while courthouse visitors watched from every direction. "Restricted areas are for authorized personnel only," he said, "not random people wandering in off the street." Claire picked up each page carefully, smoothing bent corners with trembling fingers. One sheet slid several feet away across the marble, stopping beside the shoes of an elderly woman standing in line for security. Claire looked up instantly. "I'm sorry," she whispered politely as she reached for it. The elderly woman tried to hand the paper back, but Hayes stepped between them. "Ma'am, stay behind the line." His voice carried through the lobby again. The old woman flinched slightly. Claire noticed it immediately. Even kneeling on the floor, embarrassed in front of strangers, she still looked more concerned about the woman than herself. "She was only helping me," Claire said softly. Hayes ignored her. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." The sentence hung in the cold courthouse air like smoke. Somewhere near the elevators, a phone camera lifted quietly. Claire finally stood, holding the stack of papers tightly against her chest again. Her breathing stayed slow, controlled. She looked toward the executive elevators at the far end of the lobby, where brass doors reflected pale morning light across the marble floor. "Officer," she said gently, "if I'm late for this meeting, it's going to become a problem for a lot of people." Hayes let out a short laugh. "Trust me," he replied, stepping closer as the sound of distant thunder rolled outside the courthouse windows. "You're already the problem." The lobby remained painfully quiet after Officer Hayes spoke. Even the steady beep of the security scanners seemed softer now, buried beneath the weight of dozens of watching eyes. Claire Whitmore stood motionless near the checkpoint, her damp beige coat hanging loosely against her shoulders while rain tapped gently against the massive courthouse windows 40 feet above the marble floor. She could feel people staring at her from every direction, but she refused to let embarrassment change the calm expression on her face. Hayes still held her navy folder beneath one arm, like evidence from a crime scene. "You are not listening to me," he said, his voice clipped and impatient. "This area is restricted until your identity is verified." Claire nodded once. "I understand that, officer. But if you open the front pocket of that folder, you will find my credentials." Hayes did not even glance down at it. Funny how everyone suddenly has credentials when security gets involved. A few courthouse clerks standing near the elevators exchanged nervous looks, but stayed silent. Nobody wanted to challenge Officer Daniel Hayes. He had worked courthouse security for nearly 15 years, and everyone knew the same thing about him. Once he made a judgment about someone, he rarely changed his mind. Claire slowly reached for the handle of her suitcase again, but Hayes stepped in front of her path. "Leave the bag." The command echoed sharply across the polished lobby. Claire looked at the suitcase for a moment before quietly letting go. Her fingers were pale from the cold rain outside. One of the younger clerks behind the information desk shifted uncomfortably. The woman looked no older than 24 and wore a courthouse badge clipped to a navy cardigan. She glanced carefully toward Claire, then toward Hayes. "Officer," she said hesitantly, "maybe we should just call upstairs and—" "I did not ask for commentary, Megan." Hayes never raised his voice, but the tension inside it made the young clerk immediately look back down at her desk. Claire noticed the embarrassment on the woman's face. "It is okay," Claire said softly. "She was only trying to help." Hayes gave a dry laugh under his breath. "You should worry about helping yourself." Outside, another wave of rain rolled across the courthouse windows, turning the morning light gray and cold. Claire looked briefly toward the executive floor elevators again. Brass reflections shimmered faintly across the marble like ripples on water. She knew she was already late. The meeting upstairs had been scheduled for 8:30 sharp, and it was now nearly 8:45. A giant clock mounted above the lobby entrance ticked loudly in the silence. Hayes finally opened the navy folder. Papers rustled beneath his hands while Claire watched quietly. Financial reports, administrative schedules, internal courthouse planning documents. Hayes flipped through them with visible annoyance until one page caught briefly under his thumb. The top of an official letterhead appeared for half a second before he shoved the papers closed again. He never noticed the title printed beneath the courthouse seal. Claire noticed it immediately, but said nothing. Hayes looked up at her with narrowed eyes. "You flew in from Chicago this morning?" Claire nodded. "Yes." "Why?" "For work." "What kind of work?" Claire paused only briefly. "The kind that starts in about 15 minutes. Hayes stared at her for another long second before unclipping his radio from his shoulder. "Control, this is Hayes. I may have an unauthorized individual attempting access to executive administration." The words spread through the lobby like ice water. Several people stopped walking altogether now. Claire lowered her eyes for just a moment, taking one slow breath while courthouse lights reflected softly across the wet marble beneath her feet. Then she looked back at him calmly and asked, "Officer Hayes, are you absolutely certain you want to do this in front of everyone?" By 7:30 that evening, the rain had stopped, but the city still carried the smell of wet concrete and expensive perfume drifting from the upper floors of the Whitmore Financial Tower. Valerie stepped carefully through the marble lobby with a fresh tray of coffee balanced against her palm, her gray housekeeping uniform still damp around the sleeves. The lobby lights reflected across the polished black floor like liquid gold, and above her, massive crystal chandeliers glowed with the kind of quiet wealth that made people lower their voices without realizing it. Men in tailored suits crossed the lobby while women in silk dresses laughed softly beside the elevators, every movement polished, practiced, controlled. Valerie kept her eyes low the way she always did in places like this. Invisible people survived longer that way. Upstairs on the 39th floor, the executive boardroom buzzed with tension hidden beneath polite smiles. The room itself looked less like an office and more like a private museum. Dark walnut walls framed floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, where thousands of tiny headlights crawled through the rain-soaked streets below. At the center of the room sat Marcus Whitmore, founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Capital, a man whose name appeared regularly on television beside words like billionaire, visionary, and kingmaker. He wore a navy suit worth more than Valerie made in 4 months, and a silver watch rested against his wrist with effortless precision. Marcus spoke calmly, but every sentence carried weight. People leaned forward when he talked. They laughed half a second too quickly at his jokes. They watched his expression before deciding how to react themselves. That was power, not noise, not threats, just silence that controlled other people. Marcus barely noticed the staff moving around him. To him, they were part of the building itself. Replaceable, forgettable, temporary. When Valerie entered quietly with the coffee service, his eyes shifted toward her for less than a second before returning to the presentation screen. But one of the investors smirked as she carefully placed cups beside the leather chairs. "Careful," the man muttered under his breath. "That tray probably costs more than her car." A few restrained laughs circled the table. Valerie heard them. Of course she did. But her face remained calm. She simply nodded once and continued pouring coffee without spilling a single drop. Marcus glanced toward her again, this time longer. Not because he cared, but because her composure interrupted the rhythm of the room. Most people reacted when embarrassed. They looked nervous or angry or ashamed. She did none of those things. She just continued working quietly beneath the glow of the recessed lights, while thunder rolled faintly beyond the windows. Marcus returned his attention to the meeting. "The Tokyo acquisition closes tomorrow morning," he said firmly. "If there is one mistake in translation or compliance, we lose $70 million before lunch." The room fell still immediately. Valerie lowered her eyes toward the documents scattered near the edge of the table while collecting empty glasses. For a brief second, something in the contract caught her attention. A phrase highlighted in red ink. Japanese characters beside an English translation that did not match. Her fingers paused slightly against the tray. Across the room, Marcus continued speaking with absolute confidence, outlining expansion plans, international leverage, and political partnerships with the cold certainty of someone accustomed to winning. Everything about him felt controlled, calculated, untouchable. Yet Valerie noticed something strange beneath it all. Exhaustion. Tiny shadows beneath his eyes. The stiffness in his jaw when nobody else was looking. The way his hand lingered against his temple after each financial projection. He looked like a man carrying something heavier than success. Outside, lightning flickered softly behind the clouds, illuminating the glass walls for a fraction of a second. Valerie quietly lifted the final coffee cup from the table, but her attention stayed on that mistranslated line in the contract. A small error. The kind powerful people overlooked because they assumed nobody beneath them could possibly understand the world they controlled. Valerie should have walked away. That was the rule in buildings like this. People in her position were expected to clean the room, refill the glasses, disappear quietly, and leave important conversations to powerful men wearing $1,000 shoes. But as she gathered the final stack of empty porcelain cups near the end of the table, the mistranslated clause continued pulling at her attention like a loose thread that refused to break. The Japanese text beside the acquisition agreement did not authorize a temporary licensing transfer the way the English version claimed. It authorized permanent control, full ownership. The difference was not small. It was catastrophic. Valerie felt her pulse tighten beneath her collar. Around her, the executives continued discussing timelines and media strategy with complete confidence. Nobody else had noticed. Or maybe nobody else in the room could actually read the original language. She hesitated beside the door while the city lights shimmered through the rain beyond the windows. Her mother had always warned her about moments like this. Some rooms punish honesty, she used to say while ironing uniforms late at night inside their tiny apartment on the south side. Valerie could still hear the old radiator rattling beside those memories. She could still smell laundry soap and burnt coffee from nights when bills piled higher than hope. Quiet people survived by staying invisible. But another voice rose inside her too. The voice that carried years of sacrifice, years of studying borrowed language textbooks at public libraries, years of professors telling her she was one of the brightest students they had ever taught before money forced her to leave college and work full-time after her father became sick. She looked toward Marcus Whitmore again. He stood near the presentation screen now, one hand resting in his pocket while investors listened carefully to every word. The room trusted him completely. And in less than 24 hours, that mistake would cost his company millions. Valerie swallowed once. Then she spoke softly. "Excuse me, sir." The room barely reacted at first. Marcus turned slowly, irritation already forming across his face at being interrupted by someone carrying a cleaning tray. "What is it?" he asked flatly. Valerie stepped forward carefully. "I think there may be an issue with the translation in Section 12 of the acquisition contract." Silence spread instantly across the boardroom. One executive blinked in confusion before laughing under his breath. Another leaned back in his chair with visible amusement. Marcus stared at her for several seconds without speaking. "You think there is an issue," he repeated slowly, the disbelief in his tone colder than anger. Valerie kept her posture straight even as heat climbed into her face. "Yes, sir. The Japanese clause does not appear to match the English interpretation." A few people exchanged looks now. One investor smirked openly. "This should be interesting." Marcus walked toward the table and picked up the contract with controlled patience, like a man humoring a child. "And you read Japanese?" he asked. Valerie nodded once. "I studied it in college." The room changed subtly after that sentence. Not respectful. Worse. Curious. Skeptical. People looked at her differently now, trying to reconcile the woman collecting coffee cups with the calm intelligence in her voice. Marcus opened the contract and scanned the highlighted section briefly before handing it toward one of his legal advisors. "Show her," he said coolly. "Let us see what our housekeeping department discovered." The words landed softly, but the humiliation beneath them filled the room immediately. Valerie felt every eye settle onto her uniform, her damp sleeves, the housekeeping badge pinned near her chest. Yet she stepped closer anyway. Her voice remained steady as she pointed toward the clause. The phrase here refers to permanent controlling interest, not temporary operational authority. The English translation changes the legal ownership structure completely. No one laughed this time. The legal advisor frowned slightly as he reread the line. And for the first time that evening, Marcus Whitmore stopped looking at Valerie like furniture. The silence inside the boardroom grew heavier with every second the legal advisor reread the contract. Rainwater slid slowly down the windows behind him, while the soft hum of the city filled the spaces nobody wanted to speak into first. Valerie stood motionless beside the table, still holding the empty serving tray against her waist. She could feel the temperature in the room changing around her. A few minutes earlier, she had been invisible. Now every eye followed her like she had crossed some line nobody expected her to touch. The legal advisor cleared his throat quietly before looking toward Marcus Whitmore with visible discomfort. "She is correct," he admitted at last. "The ownership clause is materially different in the original language." The words landed hard. One investor immediately leaned forward in his chair. "How did our translation team miss that?" Another executive opened his laptop again with sudden urgency, while papers shifted sharply across the table. Marcus said nothing at first. His jaw tightened as he stared at the contract in silence, processing the scale of what almost happened. $70 million. International liability. Public humiliation if the deal collapsed after signing. Valerie lowered her eyes slightly, relieved the mistake had been caught. But relief lasted only a moment. "Where exactly did you study Japanese?" Marcus asked suddenly. His tone remained calm, but colder now. Valerie looked back toward him carefully. "Northwestern University," she answered softly. "I completed 3 years before leaving school." One of the investors frowned immediately. "You left?" Valerie nodded once. "My father became ill." Marcus continued staring at her, unreadable. "And now you work housekeeping in this building." It was not a question. Valerie felt the familiar sting behind the words, the subtle reminder that the room had already decided what people like her were supposed to become. "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. Marcus walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. His reflection stretched dark against the glass, while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond downtown. "Do you understand what happens if incorrect information spreads before tomorrow morning?" he asked without turning around. Valerie blinked, confused. "Sir." Marcus faced the room again. "This acquisition is confidential. If anyone outside this boardroom learns there was a legal discrepancy tonight, the market reacts before opening bell." His voice sharpened now, controlled but dangerous. "That includes employees." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Valerie felt her stomach tighten. "I would never discuss private company information," she said carefully. One executive muttered something under his breath about liability. Another whispered to the legal team beside him. Suddenly, the same people who ignored her 30 minutes earlier were discussing her like a problem that needed containment. Marcus stepped closer toward her again. "You inserted yourself into a high-level corporate negotiation you were not authorized to participate in." Valerie gripped the tray slightly tighter. "I was only trying to help. That is not your responsibility." His words hit harder because he spoke them so quietly. No yelling, no insults. Just the cold reminder of where she stood in the hierarchy of the room. Valerie felt heat rise into her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. If I had stayed silent, the company would have signed the wrong agreement. Marcus looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The executives around the table avoided eye contact now, uncomfortable with the tension tightening across the room. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "Leave the tray and wait outside." Valerie hesitated slightly. "Sir, I did not mean any disrespect." "Outside," he repeated firmly. The softness was gone from his voice now. Valerie slowly placed the tray onto the side counter beside the espresso machine. The porcelain cups rattled faintly against the metal surface as she stepped toward the door. She could feel humiliation burning across her skin with every step, not because she had been wrong, but because doing the right thing had still left her standing alone. Before she exited, she heard one investor whisper quietly across the table, "You cannot have staff interfering in executive business. It sets a dangerous precedent." Valerie paused only for half a second before continuing into the hallway. Behind her, the heavy boardroom door closed with a deep metallic click, and suddenly the warmth, light, and power of the room disappeared all at once. The hallway outside the executive boardroom felt colder than the rest of the building. Valerie stood alone beside the dark glass windows with her hands folded tightly in front of her apron while the city stretched endlessly beneath the storm clouds below. Midnight traffic moved slowly through downtown Chicago like thin rivers of red and white light cutting across the wet streets. Somewhere far below, a siren echoed briefly before fading into the rain. Inside the boardroom, muffled voices continued behind the heavy doors. Lawyers, executives, men with expensive educations and polished titles discussing damage control in calm, measured tones. Valerie stared at her reflection in the glass. The fluorescent ceiling lights washed softly across her face, catching the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She suddenly became aware of every detail about herself. The damp cuffs of her uniform, the ache in her feet after 10 hours of work, the housekeeping badge clipped near her chest with her name printed in fading black letters. For a moment, embarrassment settled heavily over her shoulders. Not because she had spoken up, but because the room had reminded her exactly where society believed she belonged. She closed her eyes briefly and exhaled slowly. Her father used to tell her that dignity was something nobody could hand you and nobody could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. She remembered sitting beside his hospital bed 2 years earlier while winter snow tapped softly against the window. He had looked weak then, thinner than she had ever seen him, but his voice remained steady. "The world will try to measure you by what you wear, Valerie," he told her quietly. "Do not help them forget your soul." The memory lingered warmly inside her now while cold rain streaked across the glass outside. Valerie reached into her apron pocket and pulled out her old silver subway card, turning it gently between her fingers. It was scratched and worn from years of early train rides to college classes before sunrise. Japanese language notes still filled half the notebooks stacked beside her bed at home. Sometimes she still studied late at night after work, not because anyone expected her to, but because learning had once made her feel limitless. A cleaning cart sat abandoned near the far wall of the hallway, one wheel squeaking faintly whenever the building air system shifted. Somewhere overhead, soft jazz music drifted through hidden speakers designed to make wealthy people feel relaxed without noticing why. Valerie leaned lightly against the window and looked down at the city again. Thousands of people moving through their own private struggles. Delivery drivers, nurses, security guards, single mothers, men sleeping inside subway stations while billion-dollar deals happened overhead. The distance between worlds inside one city felt enormous tonight. Yet despite everything, Valerie did not regret speaking. Not even now. She could still see the contract clearly in her mind. She could still hear the legal advisor admitting she was right. That truth mattered more than pride, more than humiliation, more than the coldness in Marcus Whitmore's voice. Thunder rolled softly again beyond the skyline, while faint reflections of office lights shimmered across the rainwater below. Valerie watched a janitor quietly mop the far end of the hallway, moving slowly beneath the golden ceiling lights without anyone noticing him. Invisible labor. Invisible people. The kind of people powerful men only saw when something went wrong. Her throat tightened slightly at the thought, but she blinked the emotion away before tears could form. She refused to cry in this building. Not tonight. A few moments later, the boardroom doors finally opened behind her. Voices spilled briefly into the hallway before fading again. Valerie straightened instinctively and slipped the subway card back into her pocket. Footsteps approached across the marble floor, slow and deliberate. She expected security, maybe termination papers, maybe another quiet humiliation wrapped in corporate politeness. But when the footsteps stopped beside her, the silence felt different somehow. Heavier, less certain. Valerie turned slowly toward the sound of the footsteps and found Marcus Whitmore standing beside her near the windows. Up close, he looked different now than he had inside the boardroom. The The sharp confidence was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. His tie hung slightly loosened near the collar, and the exhaustion she noticed earlier no longer hid behind polished corporate composure. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The city lights reflected across the glass between them, while rainwater drifted slowly down the windows like silver lines melting through the night. Marcus looked out over downtown Chicago before finally speaking in a lower voice than before. The translation team confirmed it. Valerie remained still. I understand. He glanced toward her briefly. Do you? She hesitated. You almost signed away controlling ownership of the company's international infrastructure division. Marcus studied her carefully after that answer. Not like a servant. Not like a disruption. Like a problem he could not immediately solve. 3 law firms reviewed those documents, he said quietly. 2 senior analysts. An international compliance team. Valerie nodded once. Mistakes still happen. Marcus gave a faint, humorless smile at that. Apparently. Silence settled between them again. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator bell chimed softly before fading. The janitor at the far end continued mopping in slow, steady motions beneath the dim lights, unnoticed by everyone except Valerie. Marcus followed her gaze briefly before speaking again. You said you studied at Northwestern. Yes, sir. Why did you never finish? Valerie lowered her eyes toward the marble floor. My father needed dialysis 3 times a week. My mother worked nights. Somebody had to help pay rent. Marcus absorbed the answer without interruption. For the first time in years, nobody in his world was speaking to him with rehearsed ambition or calculated politeness. Valerie answered simply because the truth required no performance. He leaned lightly against the glass beside her. You could have used what you knew tonight to embarrass people in that room. Valerie looked genuinely confused. Why would I want to do that? Marcus stared at her. The question seemed to unsettle him more than the contract itself. In his world, information was leverage. Mistakes became opportunities. Weakness invited exploitation. Yet the woman standing beside him had protected people who barely acknowledged her existence. She had saved the deal quietly, then accepted humiliation without retaliation. Marcus suddenly remembered the investor laughing about her car earlier that evening. He remembered his own voice telling her she had crossed boundaries. The memory sat heavier now than he expected. Valerie folded her hands calmly in front of her apron again. My father always believed that if you can prevent harm, you should. Marcus looked down briefly, jaw tightening. Your father sounds wiser than most executives I know. The word surprised even him. Valerie smiled faintly for the first time all night. Small, careful, human. It changed something in the atmosphere immediately. Marcus noticed how tired she looked standing there after midnight in a damp housekeeping uniform, while people upstairs debated stock projections worth more than entire neighborhoods. He thought about the executives still inside arguing over liability exposure, while the person who actually saved the company stood quietly in the hallway expecting termination. The realization struck harder than he wanted to admit. For years, Marcus had built his empire by trusting credentials, status, prestige, power. Tonight, the only person who truly protected his company had been the woman clearing coffee cups from the table. Rain tapped softly against the windows again, while distant lightning flickered across the clouds beyond Lake Michigan. Marcus exhaled slowly before speaking once more. You should not be working housekeeping. Valerie gave a gentle shrug. Sometimes life decides differently. But Marcus kept looking at her now with something unfamiliar in his expression. Not pity. Respect. Real respect. And somewhere deep beneath the weight of his success, Marcus Whitmore realized something uncomfortable for the very first time in years. The smartest person in the room had been the one everyone worked hardest to ignore. Marcus Whitmore remained beside the window for several more seconds, watching the rain slide down the glass, while thoughts moved heavily behind his eyes. Valerie stood quietly near him, uncertain why the most powerful man in the building had not simply walked away already. In rooms like this, wealthy men rarely paused long enough to reconsider themselves. Yet something about tonight refused to settle easily inside him. The boardroom doors opened again farther down the hallway, and 2 executives stepped out carrying folders against their chests. Their conversation stopped immediately when they noticed Marcus standing beside the housekeeping employee they had mocked less than an hour earlier. One of them gave a polite nod. We are ready whenever you are, Marcus. Marcus did not move. His eyes stayed on the city below. Cancel the rest of tonight's meetings. The executives exchanged confused looks. Sir, tomorrow morning too. His tone carried quiet finality now. Reschedule everything. The men nodded quickly and disappeared back down the hallway without another question. Valerie looked toward him carefully. You do not need to do that because of me. Marcus gave a faint exhale through his nose. This is not because of you. But even he knew the statement was incomplete. He turned toward her fully now beneath the warm hallway lights. How long have you worked here? Almost 11 months. And nobody knew about your education? Valerie offered a small tired smile. Nobody asked. The answer stayed with him. Nobody asked. Such a simple sentence. Yet it exposed something ugly about the world he had spent years mastering. Marcus suddenly thought about the thousands of employees inside his company whose names he would never learn, whose stories disappeared beneath uniforms, security badges, and payroll numbers. He had always believed merit rose naturally to the surface. Tonight proved otherwise. Sometimes talent stayed buried because nobody considered certain people worthy of being seen. Valerie shifted slightly beside the window. I should probably finish my floor assignments before my supervisor notices I disappeared. Marcus stared at her for a moment before speaking quietly. You are worried about your shift after saving this company from a catastrophic legal failure. Valerie shrugged gently. Rent is still due on Friday. The honesty of it hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. Marcus looked down briefly, ashamed in a way he had not experienced in years. His entire adult life revolved around numbers so large they barely felt real anymore. Yet the woman beside him still measured life in subway fare, utility bills, and late rent notices. And somehow she still carried more grace than most people he knew. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a clean white business card with silver lettering across the front. He held it toward her carefully. Valerie hesitated before taking it. Tomorrow morning, he said, I want you upstairs on the executive floor at 9 o'clock. Her eyes widened slightly. Sir, Human Resources will arrange temporary consulting access. Valerie looked genuinely overwhelmed now. I am not asking for charity. Neither am I. His voice softened for the first time all evening. I am asking for competence. Valerie looked down at the card in her hand, while silence settled gently between them again. She remembered every job interview that ended the moment employers saw her address. Every scholarship she lost after leaving school. Every person who spoke slowly to her because of her uniform. Yet standing here now, she felt none of the triumph she imagined moments like this would bring. Only exhaustion and relief. Marcus studied her expression carefully. After the way people treated you tonight, most would have walked away and let us fail. Valerie looked back toward the rain outside the windows. Maybe, she answered softly. But if somebody is about to drive off a bridge, you still warn them even if they never bothered learning your name. Marcus lowered his eyes after that. The hallway grew quiet except for distant thunder rolling beyond the skyline. Then, after a long silence, the billionaire who once barely acknowledged her existence spoke words nobody in that building had likely ever heard from him before. Miss Williams, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Valerie stood quietly beneath the warm hallway lights, holding the silver-edged business card in one hand while Marcus Whitmore's apology lingered between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city beyond the windows continued glowing beneath the rain like a living ocean of light and motion, distant and endless beneath the dark sky. Valerie looked down briefly before answering in the same calm voice she had carried all night. You do not owe me anything, sir. Marcus lowered his eyes for a second, almost ashamed by how quickly she offered grace after everything that happened. That is not true, he said softly. Valerie studied him carefully now. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. Not the powerful executive from the boardroom. Just a tired man, standing alone after midnight realizing success had slowly stripped something human from him. She could see it clearly now in the silence between his words. The loneliness. The pressure. The years spent trusting status over sincerity. Marcus glanced toward the closed boardroom doors behind him. Most people in my position stop hearing honesty after a certain point, he admitted quietly. Everybody tells you what protects their access. Valerie nodded slightly. That sounds exhausting. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth for the first time that evening. Real this time. Small but real. Down the hallway, the janitor finished mopping the marble floor, and slowly pushed his cart toward the service elevator without anyone acknowledging him. Valerie watched him disappear behind the closing metal doors. Then she looked back at Marcus. "People want to feel seen," she said gently, "even when they pretend they do not." The words settled deeply inside him. Marcus thought about the years spent rushing through lobbies without noticing faces, shaking hands without remembering names, building an empire while slowly losing connection to ordinary humanity. Tonight, a woman everyone overlooked had reminded him of something wealth could not buy back once lost: decency. The rain outside finally began to slow, leaving thin silver streaks across the windows as downtown Chicago shimmered quietly beneath the clouds. Valerie slipped the business card carefully into her apron pocket beside the old subway pass she carried every day. "I should go finish my shift," she said softly. Marcus nodded, but before she turned away, he spoke again. "Miss Williams." She paused. "Tomorrow morning, when you arrive upstairs, nobody will treat you the way they did tonight." Valerie looked at him calmly. "You cannot control how people see me." Marcus held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he admitted, "but I can control what kind of man I choose to be after this." The honesty in his voice surprised them both. Valerie gave a small nod filled not with triumph, but understanding. Then she turned quietly and began walking down the long marble hallway toward the service elevators. Her shoes made soft sounds against the polished floor while the lights above reflected gently across the damp fabric of her uniform. Marcus remained near the windows, watching her disappear farther down the corridor. No dramatic music, no applause, no crowd suddenly recognizing her worth. Just silence, honest silence. Halfway down the hallway, Valerie passed a framed wall of executive photographs stretching back 30 years inside the company. Men in dark suits. Perfect smiles. Perfect titles. As she walked past them, the overhead lights caught the reflection of her name badge briefly against the glass. "Williams." She continued forward without slowing down. At the far end of the corridor, the elevator doors opened with a soft metallic hum. Warm light spilled outward across the marble floor. Valerie stepped inside quietly and turned once toward the hallway behind her. Marcus Whitmore still stood beside the rain-covered windows, smaller now against the enormous city skyline. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man standing above everyone else and more like someone finally learning how to stand beside them. The elevator doors closed gently between them, and outside the tower, the storm finally began to clear.